for just one more day. But this cold front is going to make its way southwards through this evening and overnight into the start of the weekend, just marking a change to something a little cooler. But to start today, there is a patchy frost around across Scotland, West Wales and southwest England. Otherwise, it's a rather cloudy start to the day, with the exception of Scotland that will see plenty of sunshine throughout. As we head into this afternoon, we'll start to see some cloud breaking up across eastern coast. So there'll be some sunshine here as we go through this afternoon, allowing temperatures to rise just a little higher in places than what we saw yesterday. But with those clearer spells round as we go into this evening, we might just see an early frost in a few places down the eastern half of the UK. But cloud will swiftly make its way back in from the east, spreading southwestwards through tonight and into the early hours of Saturday. So by the time we get to Saturday morning, it will really just be Scotland and high ground of England and Wales. So that might just see some frost to start the weekend. So for many, it will be quite a cloudy start to Saturday. There will be a few breaks around and still the odd shower in any thicker cloud. But we draw our attention to this band of showers, that is that cold front making its way in from the northeast. And some of these showers could be wintry over higher ground. Behind this as well, the winds become northerly, so particularly across the northeast tomorrow, we will start to see temperatures dropping a little below average for the time of year. But as we go through the rest of the weekend, we will see some sunny spells, but also wintry showers starting to show their hand and temperatures starting to drop a little, particularly over the northern half of the UK.
I'm Michael Portillo. Join me on GB News on a Sunday morning for topical discussion, debate, arts and culture, and sometimes even ethical dilemmas.
I don't always agree with you, Michael.
Michael Portillo, Sundays on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, "Nana, stop arguing." I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment.
I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
GB News has its own late-night paper preview show, Headliners, where comedians take you through the next day's top news stories. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper, we've got it covered for you. Headliners, every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hi, Andrew Pierce here. Join me every Friday lunchtime for a proper no-nonsense debrief of the week's events. With special guests in the studio and the GB News team on the ground, I'll be getting you up to date with news, some intelligent discussion and my own sharp take. The weekend starts here with me every Friday lunchtime on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat. Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, "Oh my God, what's she doing now?"
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. I campaigned in the largest democratic vote in our island story. I know this country has so much to be proud of. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better. The wisdom of the nation is in its people. Vox Populi, Vox Dei. That's why I'm joining the People's Channel. Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
What makes a country prosperous? What went wrong in the Manchester Arena bombing? And has Sir Keir Starmer stuck his foot in it by insulting the Polish? These are three questions we'll attempt to answer this morning on The Briefing.
Good morning, it's 9:30. I'm Rhiannon Jones in the GB newsroom. Conservative MP Jacob Rees-Mogg is calling for a proper inquiry into Sue Gray's appointment as Sir Keir Starmer's new Chief of Staff. The senior civil servant led an independent investigation into Partygate, but it was announced yesterday that she was leaving the civil service to join the Labour Party. Allies of Boris Johnson have condemned her new role, with the Tory party chair calling it inappropriate. Mr Rees-Mogg says the appointment invalidates her report into lockdown breaches at Number 10.
Former MP accepted her two reports on the strict understanding that she was impartial, and that now looks wrong. No confidence can be placed in the evidence she secured or passed the police, so instead there should be an investigation into her and to her appointment. We should have an inquiry into what she has done and her contacts with Labour whilst she's been a civil servant, particularly those with the office of the Leader of the Opposition.
Further leaked WhatsApp messages by Matt Hancock suggest his team asked if they could lock up Nigel Farage for being a pub hooligan and breaking lockdown rules. The messages, revealed by The Telegraph, were allegedly sent in 2020 after Mr Farage shared a video of himself drinking at a pub. A fortnight earlier, he was at a Trump rally in the US. Under COVID lockdown rules, anyone coming to England from abroad was required to quarantine for 14 days or face a £1,000 fine. Constance Martin and Mark Gordon will appear in court this morning after the remains of a baby were found in Brighton. The pair have been charged with gross negligence, manslaughter, concealing the birth of a child and perverting the course of justice. The body of a newborn was found in an area of woodland in Hollingbury on Wednesday after a two-day search. The couple, who were arrested on Monday, will appear at Crawley Magistrates Court later. And it may be March, but a cold weather alert is being issued as wintry showers and freezing temperatures are expected across England next week. The UK Health Security Agency says very cold air will spread across the UK from Monday night, bringing with it snow and a risk of ice. It's set to last until midnight on Wednesday. TV, online and DAB+ radio, this is GB News. Now it's back to the briefing with Tom.
Good morning, it's 9:33 and this is The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and your radio. And what a day it was in politics yesterday. It seemed like we couldn't move for stories, not least the idea that senior civil servant Sue Gray, the woman who investigated those lockdown parties in Downing Street, had been offered a job as Sir Keir Starmer's Chief of Staff. Now, this poses questions about the independence of her investigation and the resulting fines that occurred. Let's ask the former... explore this now with our political reporter, Catherine Forster, who is live in the studio with us. And Catherine, this was the most extraordinary piece of news. Sue Gray has been described as an independent civil service, someone who is ferociously independent, and yet now an appointment from the leader of the Labour Party.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? She's worked in Whitehall as a impartial civil servant for decades. She's been at the heart of government. She's had very, very trusted positions. She did, of course, oversee the Partygate inquiry, which was a major factor in bringing Boris Johnson's premiership to an end. And here she is now, about to go, apparently, from a high civil service position in the Cabinet Office, from which she resigned yesterday with immediate effect, to helping the leader of the opposition win the next election. So, obviously, questions are being asked. Now, lots of Conservative MPs are absolutely furious. Jacob Rees-Mogg, of course, former Cabinet Minister, GB News presenter, is calling for an inquiry. He's calling for Rishi Sunak to block the appointment. People are saying, you know, this is obviously proving to them that Partygate was a mechanism to get rid of Boris Johnson. But, of course, Sue Gray did not hold the parties or orchestrate the parties. The parties, the gatherings, whatever you want to call them, took place and the media reported on them, and the Partygate investigation took place, and then the police chose to issue fines.
Although the police, of course, only issued one fine to Boris Johnson for a gathering that many people raised an eyebrow at, in terms of it looked like the least party-like party I think anyone had ever possibly seen. But an interesting point here is that when a senior civil servant leaves the civil service to join another position, particularly if that position is political, the Prime Minister has a veto on that appointment. They can hold off someone joining. So technically, Rishi Sunak could say, under the terms of the Civil Service Code of Conduct, Sue Gray, you cannot take this post. Do you think he will?
I think it's unlikely, because I think there would be an almighty row about that. But what I think more likely to happen is there will now be a gap between her leaving the civil service and her joining Keir Starmer's team of probably 3 months, but it could be up to 2 years. Rishi Sunak could say, OK, you can take this job in 2 years, which would be after the next election. And obviously, Keir Starmer wants her now because she's got massive experience of how government works, the inner workings of government.
Some might say she also has massive experience of knowing the deepest, darkest secrets of all those within the Tory party.
Well, she certainly does. And there are concerns, of course, that she does have all this inside knowledge, and she's now going to take that knowledge, and what is she going to do with it? So it's a coup for Keir Starmer. He's desperate to get ready for government as he sees it. He sees her as very upstanding, but it does raise all sorts of questions. And there's quite a number of civil servants very unhappy about this, because they feel that it does call the civil service's impartiality massively into question.
And looking at examples of this in the past, when people from the civil service have moved into politics proper, when the Downing Street civil servant Laura Wilde was made a Conservative peer by David Cameron back in 2016, she was prevented from taking her seat in the Lords for a year. Now, the woman who prevented her taking that seat, because of all of the propriety and ethics rules, can you guess the name of the woman, the senior civil servant who stopped that political appointment of that civil servant to join the Lords? It was none other than Sue Gray. I wonder if this might come back to bite her.
Well, yes, and she was in charge of proprietary and ethics for 6 years, between 2012 and 2018. And so, yes, there is, to some extent, a precedent in that Tony Blair got Jonathan Powell as his chief of staff. He'd previously been a civil servant. But this very quick and abrupt transfer does raise all sorts of questions. And it does really undermine, in many people's minds now, the Partygate inquiry. So you can really understand why the Conservatives, or Boris Johnson's allies in particular, are very, very angry indeed.
I suppose it shouldn't be missed that just yesterday Boris Johnson, speaking at the Global Soft Power Summit, made a little allusion to the fact that he didn't quite understand why he was fined. In a passage talking about how everyone lives under the rule of law, he said that I somehow got fined for eating at the cabinet table. I wonder if we're going to hear a bit more from Boris Johnson coming up now.
I think we might well. And I mean, of course, Boris Johnson was very quiet after Rishi Sunak and the Windsor framework appeared to land so very, very well. And then he came out yesterday, didn't he, highly critical of the Prime Minister's deal, and also throwing in little bombs like, oh, by the way, we were only a handful of points behind in the polls when I left. And he clearly feels that he has unfinished business now. He told the meeting at the Queen Elizabeth II Centre that he thought he wouldn't have any more big jobs in politics. That's what he says. But clearly, he does feel that he was pushed out unfairly. He said in his leaving speech, they changed the rules part way through, but them's the breaks. He's clearly very upset about what happened and doesn't fundamentally feel that he was treated fairly. Although, I mean, it has to be said, it was his own MPs who resigned, you know, dozens and dozens of them, and it was the Chris Pincher affair rather than Partygate that ultimately brought him down. But still, Partygate was a massive, massive part of it.
And when the herd moves, it moves, so said Boris Johnson. Catherine Forster, thank you so much for talking us through those issues. Let's get more now with Daniel Kaczynski, the Conservative MP for Shrewsbury and Ayrsham, who joins us outside Parliament. And Daniel, first of all, what do you make of this appointment? Is this something that has been done properly by the Labour Party?
Well, I have a great concern about it, and I've been calling for a major reform of the civil service for many years, very much in favour of the American system, where a new democratically elected government brings in its own civil servants, and when that government is removed from office, there is a change of civil servants as well. This is yet another example of where we have seen senior members of the civil service show ultimately potentially their colours by moving to work in the office of the leader of the opposition. So this will just add yet another fire to the fuel to the fire, I should say, about the need for a major overhaul and reform of our civil service.
Should the Prime Minister block this appointment?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely, he should. And when Mrs. Gray has undertaken such an extraordinary report, which ultimately led to, in part, to the removal of a sitting Conservative Prime Minister, then for her to immediately want to almost straight away go and work for the opposition, it just does not smack right. And I think a lot of journalists and a lot of people out there in the United Kingdom will also sense a concern about her conduct.
Now, Daniel Kaczynski, we also want to talk to you about another issue involving the leader of the Labour Party, and that's a new phrase that he's been using this week. He said it on Monday, he repeated it at Prime Minister's questions, which was, Poland is set to become richer than Britain, which in his view is unacceptable. He says that Poland should never be richer than the United Kingdom. Now, Daniel Kaczynski, you are the chair of the all-party parliamentary group on Poland, and you wrote a letter to Sir Keir Starmer after his comments on Poland. What exactly did you say in this letter?
Well, I'm very proud to be the first ever Polish-born British Member of Parliament, and I'm the only Conservative Member of Parliament who was actually born in a communist country. At that time, Poland was a politically Orwellian society and an economically illiterate one, with communism imposed on her and her being trapped behind the Iron Curtain following the Second World War. So all the elites of Poland were murdered and destroyed. All the great elite institutions were removed by the communists. And yet Poland now has raced ahead. And she's raced ahead really because of a dynamism, a determination of the people there to create business, create prosperity and wealth. And I think rather than denigrating Poland as he has done, as if it's some sort of a banana republic, he should recognize that there are lessons to be learned as to why one European country can create the sort of dynamism, prosperity and wealth that we here in the United Kingdom ought to be emulating. But of course he won't, because Sir Keir is all about redistribution of wealth rather than the creation of wealth.
I suppose it is important context in this conversation to note it's not just the United Kingdom on a per-person basis that Poland is projected to become richer than in the next decade or so, but also France. And yet we don't hear so much in our commentariat about France being overtaken by Poland too. It is a story of extraordinary success of Poland. I wonder, though, in your letter, Daniel, you use the words borderline racism around Sir Keir Starmer's comments. Do you really believe that?
I do, and the reason I wrote the letter is at the request of the Polish diaspora. Here in the United Kingdom, we benefit enormously from having 900,000 Poles who have come and settled here. They make a tremendous contribution to the United Kingdom. Many Poles, of course, came here during the Second World War. And as you know, the 303 squadron shot down, Polish 303 squadron shot down more enemy aircraft than any other squadron in the Battle of Britain. Polish mathematicians and cryptographers were at Bletchley helping to break the Enigma codes. And Polish soldiers joined the British 8th Army at Tobruk, Alamein and Monte Cassino. So the Poles have a very, very, very proud history of supporting their British allies, and there are many Poles living and contributing here in the United Kingdom, and many Polish people, as I go round the country, going to Polish schools, meeting young Polish children, seeing Polish businesses. I've got to know a lot of them around the United Kingdom, and there's a lot of anger from them, and they have asked me to write this letter because they feel that Sir Keir is being racist. If he was referring to, let's say, perhaps a country outside of Europe, there would have been a significant backlash. Let's make sure that all countries, irrespective of where they are, irrespective of what their religions are, their faiths and cultures are treated in a respectful way.
Now, Daniel, we were going to let you go. However, in the last couple of minutes, as you have been speaking, there's been some more news about the Labour Party. The MP Neil Coyle has been suspended from the House of Commons for 5 days, assessed by the Independent Assessment Panel over issues of bullying. Now, this was following one report of anti-Chinese racism alleged in some comments to do with a conversation in a parliamentary bar some time ago. I wonder, Daniel Kaczynski, do you think that there's a problem of racism within the Labour Party?
Well, I'm not going to get into that sort of level of attack on the Labour Party, but all I will say is that living in a multicultural society, as we do, benefiting from having a more multicultural society than many other European countries is something that we ought to celebrate. It's something that we ought to all recognise and celebrate. And any form of racism to any person due to their skin colour, faith, creed or sexuality is wrong. And of course the House of Commons, we have now in place a very strong system with the Commissioner for Parliamentary Standards who will investigate any such inappropriate behaviour. So I don't know anything about the story. I'm on my way back to the House of Commons where I'll find out more about it, but you'll forgive me for not commenting too much until I know the story.
No, of course. Daniel Kaczynski, thank you so much for joining us here this morning to talk through and live react to those stories there. We really appreciate your time. Now, I should say that Neil Coyle has been recommended for suspension for 5 days. That suspension has not yet taken place. There is a process that takes place now. But moving on, we were talking a little bit about prosperity there, about the relative prosperity of Poland, France and the United Kingdom. Well, the Legatum Institute's Prosperity Index report was released this week, monitoring global prosperity across the developed and developing economies, and, of course, how the pandemic has impacted these countries. Well, I'm delighted to be joined live in the studio by Dr. Stephen Bryan, the Director of Policy at the Legatum Institute. And, Dr. Bryan, what is exactly the Prosperity Index? How do you measure prosperity across such different economies?
Well, our aim is to take a view of the world that goes beyond GDP and to think about what are the foundations that make for a society that allows everybody to have a fulfilled life. So not only looking at the economy, but upstream in terms of institutions, we've just heard a reference to them now, around the quality of safety and security, strength of freedoms, how good is governance, through to levels of infrastructure, trade, for example, business dynamism, but then really also asking, do these resources and the wealth of the economy go to people's well-being? For example, people have good education, good health, good living conditions. So really trying to get that virtuous circle, from strong institutions, good economies to good well-being.
Now, what have been the big moves in the index this year? Of course, you publish annually. Have there been any standout success stories?
There have been a few. Interestingly, and just neighbouring Poland, Lithuania in Europe has been the biggest gainer in the last year, showing a lot of improvement and really coming out of the shadow of Estonia, which in the past in the Baltics had been the high flyer. But you mentioned developing countries. Some of the biggest gains overall have been in Africa. Kenya, for example, is the global standout success of the last year. And we saw a good general election, a very definite improvement over previous elections there. But on a slightly longer time frame, Côte d'Ivoire, which had a civil war 10, 15 years ago, has now really got back on track. Corruption is being reduced. But what's really much more interesting is its level of business dynamism, and the regulatory environment for business has been much, much better. And as a result, it's one of the few countries that's come out of the bottom 40. Most of the countries in the bottom 40 are actually falling further behind because they're not getting access to trade. They've only got access to 12% of the global markets with trade deals, whereas Britain and the other major countries are about 45%. So, for example, if we think about the supermarket shortages we've seen recently, if countries in the developing markets had better trade access, a few flights from Abidjan and Lilongwe or Nairobi could have sorted out the supermarket shelf problem. So I think one of the things that we're spotting is that we need to encourage greater levels of trade as opposed to having a reliance on aid as being the way to help developing countries.
That's a really interesting point. And I was about to ask, is the world getting better in general? But you're speaking about those bottom 40 countries, most of them not improving. Is that a change from where we were several years ago?
I think what we're observing is that the key elements that people think about with respect to poverty are improving. So health is getting better, education is getting better. But what's really becoming clear in the last few years is that the foundations of prosperity, we go back to democracy, safety and security, civil liberties, they're weakening, and more so in these countries than the rest of the world. And that, for us, is sort of the calling card of saying, we've got an issue we've got to address. We've got to do something different.
Really, really interesting stuff there. And hopefully some lessons can be learnt and all these countries can get on that path to prosperity, so important for the wider world. Dr. Stephen Bryan, thank you so much for joining us on the briefing this morning, the Director of Policy at the Legatum Institute, of course. But finally yesterday, the third and final report into the Manchester Arena bombing was released. The inquiry found that the attack might have been prevented if MI5 had acted on key intelligence received in the months before the attack. Well, Alan Mendoza is the Executive Director at the Henry Jackson Society and joins me live in the studio. Dr. Mendoza, thank you so much for talking with us this morning. What could have been done to prevent this attack?
Well, I mean, unfortunately, we found, Tom, that there's a litany of errors going back to 2010 where the suspect, or rather the bomber, had been on various lists at various times. His behaviour had been suspect a long way through. We found various interventions that could have happened at various times. By far the worst, though, was that in the run-up to the actual bombing, firstly, he'd been to Libya, which should have, been a red flag straight away, given what was going on there with his family and beyond, and that he wasn't sort of questioned when he came back. And secondly, there was specific intelligence that could have led to the car where he was storing his explosives prior to making the bomb. And that also was not acted upon. And unfortunately, he then went, built it and detonated it.
Do we know why this intelligence wasn't acted upon? Is this about resourcing, or is this about simply failures of leadership?
Well, there was firstly questions about the way that various agencies, the police, the Secret Services, work together on the subject. But there's also analysis. Intelligence filters in. And of course, as you'll know, you get lots of intelligence coming in over lots of different subjects, and somebody has to sort it through, see the wood from the trees and pick it up, basically, and go, that's significant, I've got to deal with it. So I think there was a failure of analysis in this case, and sadly that had tragic consequences.
It is remarkable how few, perhaps, over the course of the last 2 decades, how few large attacks have actually got through. We hear quite often from the security services, or at least via the security services, that big attacks are stopped all the time. Was this a case of something just slipping through the net, or is there something more fundamental wrong here?
Well, I think you're quite right to point out that we start off from this basis that the security services in general have done a great job in preventing these cases. I think if people knew the number and the severity of what could have come down the line, they would be quite grateful for that. But the sad truth is the bomber only has to get through once for there to be a tragedy. And in this case, unfortunately, down the line, many signs were not picked up. I mean, he went to prison to visit radicalised terrorists who were in prison, basically, people who were locked up already. That was a mistake. They didn't know what was happening there. Earlier, there was misogynistic behaviour that might have been linked to his extremist beliefs. That wasn't picked up. So all the way down the line, unfortunately, in his case, he wasn't referred properly to the PREVENT programme. It wasn't taken up. So here you have a whole series of things that went wrong that if even one of them had been picked up, this might have ended differently.
Now, just finally, do you have confidence in the government and the security services to learn these lessons and change how they do things, to pick up these signs in a more comprehensive way in the future?
Well, I do, because I think, this has been a cathartic moment for the security services in particular, and you've seen the reaction. Obviously, the families, understandably, do not accept the apology, but I've never seen the Secret Services make an apology. So, from that sense, you can see there is some learning happening here. But I also take heart from the fact we had the PREVENT review, of course, last week, suggesting we've got to get serious with radical Islam, which remains, of course, the main threat to this country, despite the attempts by woke civil servants, political correctness, to drive it off the agenda. It's there, and there's only one sort of set of people who are going out right now trying to blow up kids in arenas.
Well, Dr. Alan Mendoza, thank you so much for talking us through that huge issue for us there. And that brings us to the end of the programme. So, from political news to personal news. It's been an honour to serve as political correspondent for this channel since its launch almost 2 years ago. And to present this show, The Briefing, every weekday morning for the past 18 months. After 376 episodes, countless interviews across the political spectrum, and even the occasional polemic take, I'm moving to a new role. I'm pleased to say I've been appointed as Deputy Political Editor of GB News. I'll be working alongside our new political editor, Chris Hope, when he comes on board a little bit later this year, delivering political coverage across the GB News schedule. So I'd like to say an enormous thank you to my producer, Torin, for helping us through making these shows behind the scenes for the last, many months, and for you, sitting at home watching The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood. Well, that's it for us today. Coming up next, it's Esther and Phil, so stick around for them.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being